Hey guys, Rushy here and welcome back to another video. In this video I'm going to be discussing a war that's currently happening as we speak in the Middle East. I'm going to be discussing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'm going to try and summarise the conflict as best as I can, the reasons for the war. I'm also going to give my thoughts and opinions on the conflict in terms of whose side I'm on. I'm also going to let you know my opinion on the best possible solution, resolution and outcome for this war. And I'm also going to compare this war to another war that happened 49 years ago, a similar type of war, and how I believe this war should be resolved in a similar way to that war. With all that being said, let's get into this video. So guys, I actually wasn't planning on making this video until earlier on this month. Recent events unfolded and a conflict between Palestine and Israel erupted. So to try and summarise this war, basically there's a country in the Middle East called Israel, but there's also a country there called Palestine. And over the last 100 years or so, there's been a lot of conflict between Israel and Palestine. Palestine is where Palestinian Arabs live, and Israel is where Jewish people live. Both races have historical links to that land. However, from my understanding, many years ago, the Jews left that land and they didn't have their own country. They just kept to themselves, created their own communities in other countries throughout the world. I believe Judaism is a religion, but it's also a race of people. And Palestinians have also lived in that area where Palestine and Israel is now for many years. And it wasn't until after the First World War, and especially after the Second World War, where Jews began to move to Palestine and create Israel, their own country, where Palestine used to be. So the country was divided up and the land was split between the Jewish areas and the Palestinian areas. And that's been the main source of this conflict, fighting over land. I believe there was a war in 1967 where the Jews tried to claim more land from the Palestinians and also from neighbouring countries, I believe including Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon. And then there was a war in 1973 where these countries fought back against Israel and managed to reclaim some of their land from Israel. And then there was a peace between these countries, but the conflict between Palestine and Israel has been going steadily on and off ever since. So the way the country is split up now, most of it belongs to the Jews and is called Israel, and there's two smaller areas that belongs to the Palestinians, and that's called Gaza, and there's another piece of land on the right side of Israel neighbouring Jordan, and that's called the West Bank. And this ideally is where the Palestinians are supposed to live and the Jews are supposed to live in Israel. However, the main source of conflict has been from my understanding, with Jews occupying Gaza and occupying the West Bank. Now, in 2005, I believe the Jews deoccupied Gaza. They left Gaza, but they have been occupying the West Bank ever since, up until this day. And recently, on October the 7th, the government that is in charge of Gaza, called Hamas, they launched a war with Israel. Palestinians have kidnapped Israeli civilians and brought them back to Gaza to hold hostage, but they also killed Israeli soldiers in the process. And Israel responded by launching a massive full-scale attack against Gaza, where they have killed thousands of people, but not just Hamas, but innocent Palestinian civilians. I believe over 8,000 Palestinians have been killed, with a lot of them being women and children, compared to about 2,000 Jews. So there's been a huge death toll, a combined 10,000 people dead on average, might be even higher. Most casualties have been Palestinian casualties, and the war is still going on now as we speak, and is looking likely to escalate, with no sign of a ceasefire yet. So, what are my thoughts about this war, about this conflict, what I think about it, and whose side I'm on? Well, I've been thinking this was going to happen for a long time now, and I've noticed over the past few years there's been a rise in Palestinian civilians killed by Israelis, whether it's their police or army, either in Gaza or in the West Bank region. And I remember last year an Al Jazeera journalist was killed by an Israeli soldier when she wasn't, doing anything wrong. She was just doing her job, reporting the news, and she was shot. The soldier who done it has not been brought to justice. So there's been a rise in tension of, from my understanding, of Palestinians being killed by Jews without any repercussions. So from an outsider looking in, with no connection to either race of people, it seems to me that Israel and Palestine is an apartheid state. It's a very divided piece of land, and it seems to me that the Jews are trying to conquer more of Palestinian territory. I'm personally more supportive of the Palestinian people than the Jewish people, although I don't like to see innocent civilians get killed on either side, because looking at the country of Israel and Palestine, the Jews own more of the land than the Palestinians do, and the Palestinian territories aren't even referred to as Palestine. They're called Gaza and the West Bank, and the West Bank region is occupied by Jews. So it seems that the Jews are encroaching on Palestinian land, whereas I believe there are some Palestinians who live in Israel as well, but most of them either live in Gaza or the West Bank region, and this has been going on for a long time. I believe if Israel didn't occupy the West Bank region and just lived in Israel and let the Palestinians live in Gaza and the West Bank, there wouldn't be a war. I think because the Palestinian people are being oppressed overall by the Jews more than the Jews have been oppressed by the Palestinians, this has led to this war. And yes, whilst I don't agree with killing innocent Jews and Jewish soldiers, I understand why they want to kidnap Jewish people or hold them for ransom, as long as they don't kill the hostages, because I understand their fight. They might think there's no other way of getting their demands from the Jews. I disagree with how the Jews have responded. I think they've used too much force and they've killed too many civilians. I disagree with their bombardment of Gaza, their airstrikes, because I believe they might have killed a few members of Hamas, but mostly they've killed innocent civilians, Palestinian civilians. I don't think they should be trying to attack Hamas in this full-scale war. I think they should be trying to negotiate with Hamas. But I also think Hamas should limit how many innocent civilians it kills, Jewish civilians, and also not kill any of the hostages, and specify their demands, and if their demands are met, they should release all the hostages. And I also disagree with how a lot of the world has reacted to this conflict, especially Western countries, such as my own country, Britain. I don't agree how the British government has responded to this conflict. A lot of these Western countries, such as Germany, the UK and the USA, have sided solely with the Jews against the Palestinians, and the Jews already have a very sophisticated army thanks to funding from these countries, whereas the Palestinians, they don't have such a sophisticated army. Palestinians are already at a disadvantage, so I don't see why these countries should be providing Israel with arms when they don't really need any. And I believe there should be more aid given to the Palestinian people, because from my understanding, the overwhelming majority of victims have been Palestinian civilians. And I believe these countries around the world should be insisting a ceasefire be commenced, a communication set up between Hamas and Israel, so that the hostages can be freed and the Palestinians can gain a better quality of life, more fairer and more equal to the Jewish people in that region. And I must say, I like how other countries such as Turkey and Iran have responded to this conflict by insisting on peace and speaking up for the Palestinian people, but without actually getting involved in the war directly. Like the US have said that Iran is inflating the war, whereas I disagree. And I think the US is actually inflating the war instead by providing arms and weapons and sending ships to the region. And the Iranians haven't actually sent their army to that region. They've just supplied arms to the Palestinians living in Gaza and Hamas because they have good relations with them, which I don't see as any different to the Americans supplying the Ukraine with arms. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about a historical war that reminds me of this current conflict. And the war I'm speaking of is the 1974 conflict in Cyprus. Now, Cyprus isn't actually that far away from Israel. It's an island further northwest of Israel. Now, 49 years ago, a war broke out between the Turkish civilians and the Greek civilians living in Cyprus. From my understanding, the Turkish side were being oppressed more than the Greek side, and the Greeks were killing Turkish civilians more so than the Turks were killing Greek civilians. And from my understanding, it was sort of like an ethnic cleansing, whereas the Greeks wanted the Turks to leave the island and leave Cyprus just for the Greek population only. And this had been going on for some time. I believe it started whilst the island was under British occupation. The Brits deoccupied the island. The conflict intensified up until 1974, when the Turkish army invaded the island in a military operation and started a war with the Greek population in order to try and protect Turkish Cypriots and bring peace to the island. I believe they were fighting for about a month, and they managed to end the war within a month and signed a peace agreement. Cyprus was divided between the Turkish population and the Greek population living in the island. The Turkish population moved to the north of the island, and the Greek Cypriots moved to the south of the island, and there has been a blockade put up between the northern side and the southern side. I believe it's guarded by UN peacekeepers. There has been peace ever since the war ended, and that remains to this day, 49 years later. And I believe the Jewish and Palestinian conflict can be resolved in a similar way, because the Palestinians have just as much of a right to live out in the Middle East in those regions as the Jewish people have a right to live there. Okay, so how do I think this war could be ended between the Palestinians and the Jews, and how do I think this conflict can be resolved? Well, firstly, I think the Jews should treat the Palestinian people more equally than they have before. I think they should try and negotiate with Hamas in order to release the hostages, find out their demands first of all, how they can get these Jewish people freed by Hamas freeing all the Jewish hostages, and in return the Jews deoccupying the West Bank region and leave that to the Palestinians and just focus on living in Israel, and also freeing up the movement within Gaza. I also believe that any Palestinians living in Israel should leave Israel and live either in Gaza or the West Bank region. I also believe the Jews should let Palestinians who are trapped in Gaza flee Gaza and move to the West Bank region. I believe there should be a two-state solution where part of the country should be kept for the Jews to live in, and that should be called Israel, and another part of the country should be kept solely for the Palestinians to live in, and that should be called Palestine. And at the moment, Israel is a lot bigger than Palestine, so I think they should give the Palestinians some more land, or at least let it be easier for Palestinians living in Gaza to travel to the West Bank region and vice versa. I think that would bring about peace to the conflict and end this ongoing war. Okay, guys, well, that concludes my analysis of the war between Palestine and Israel that is currently going on. So to summarize my thoughts and opinions of the conflict, I believe there should be an immediate ceasefire. I believe the Jewish army in Israel should open up communication with Hamas, the government and army of Gaza, and find out their demands and try and negotiate for Hamas to release the hostages. And in return, I believe the Jews should leave the West Bank region and only live in Israel, de-escalate how much of a blockage and control they have on Gaza in terms of what goes in and what goes out of that area, because it's only a very small area and a lot of Palestinians live there. and Israel is quite a large piece of land compared to Gaza and the West Bank, and I think Israel is plenty big enough for the Jewish people to live there alone. I don't disagree with Jewish people living in Israel, and I don't disagree with the Israeli state, but I think it should be fair, whereas all Jews should live in Israel only, and all Palestinians should live in Gaza and the West Bank regions, and those regions should be clarified as being Palestinian land and be named Palestine. I think they should divide the country in a similar way as the Turks and the Greeks divided Cyprus after the 1974 conflict, because that has been proven to be successful, and in my opinion it's a fair resolution which continues to this day. I hate to see war. I know some people like war and believe in war, but I disagree with war, and there's something I could wish for, it would be world peace. So yeah, guys, that summarises my thoughts and opinions on the conflict. I don't usually talk about worldwide events, political events. I have done in the past, but not very often. But I thought I'd speak about this war because from what I've seen on the news and how other countries have responded to this conflict, I'm shocked by the amount of biasness there has been towards the Jews compared to the lack of support towards the Palestinian people. And yeah, I think it's my duty, because I have Turkish heritage, to try and speak up for the Palestinian people, not because of my heritage, but because I can see from what I've seen on the news, they have been oppressed more so than the Jewish people have been oppressed in that region. Please feel free to let me know your thoughts on this conflict in the comments section. Also, if you know more about the conflict than I do, feel free to try and educate me more about this conflict and let me know your ideas for a solution, a ceasefire, and a resolution to this war. Moving forward, I'm going to try and speak about more political events going on around the world every so often, such as the Ukraine and Russia war, and also other political events and news, such as in Britain, in the UK where I live, the royal family, and my reaction to the Queen's death, who died last year. But I might mention that in a separate video in the future. So I'm hoping to continue making one video every month for the foreseeable future. Next month, I'm planning on making a video letting you know about a secret hobby of mine which I haven't mentioned to you before, and how you can get involved in that with me. So stay tuned. With all that being said, guys, thanks so much for watching this video. Take care, be safe, and I hope to see you all next month in my next video. Peace.